Chapter 2 of Purple Climbing Days. If you remember, Richard's a little nervous about climbing that rope. He does not feel very confident, and he tries to make excuses so as not to climb it. Let's see what happens. The class went down the hall. At the front of the line, Miss Rooney stopped. Mrs. Carroll was working on a bulletin board. Pink letters marched along the top of it. It didn't really march. That's just a nice expression of saying that she put the letters in pink on the top of the bulletin board. Mother's Day is coming. Looks great, said Miss Rooney. Mrs. Carroll sighed. Blue Monday, she said. I need a longer weekend. Don't we all? Miss Rooney nodded. I know what you mean. Blue Monday, Richard told himself. It was worse than Blue Monday. It was Purple Monday. Miss Rooney turned around. This is a snake line, she said. The class straightened the line, so snake line was going all curvy. Richard tried to keep his head in the back of Matthew's ears. They started to move again. Richard passed the bulletin board. Mrs. Carroll was putting a row of tulips along the bottom. They looked like kindergarten flowers, baby flowers. He flicked his finger at one of the stems. If you don't mind, Mrs. Carroll said. He ducked his head and kept going. Richard is not showing respect for property. The class marched into the gym. Richard looked up. The ceiling was high, almost high enough for an airplane. He looked down. He didn't want to see the rope. Have a good time, Miss Rooney said. She went out into the hall again. Richard looked around. He wondered where Mr. Bell was, the PE teacher. Snaggle-doodles, yelled Emily. A rope. Emily grabbed the rope. I can do it with my eyes closed, she said. I can almost do it with one hand. Go, Emily, yelled Matthew. I'm right behind you. Emily started up the rope. Richard closed his eyes. Hurry, yelled Matthew. I'm next. Just then the door opened. It was Mrs. Miller, the meanest substitute teacher in the school. Miller the killer. My friends, should Emily and Matthew even be on that rope without supervision? I don't think so. Mrs. Miller was wearing blue shorts and a blue sweatshirt. She looked like a big blue hippopotamus. A blue hippopotamus with little skinny legs and black sneakers. I can swing like Tarzan, Emily yelled. Mrs. Miller looked up. She blew her whistle. Get down here this minute, she shouted. Emily started down the rope. Who told you to climb? Mrs. Miller said. And without a gym teacher here to watch you. Emily jumped off the rope. I'm tough, she said. I won't fall. I don't want to hear another word, said Mrs. Miller. She turned to the class. Today I'm Mr. Bell. Everyone laughed a little. Richard raised his hand quickly. I can't do climbing today. So there she is. This is Mrs. Miller the killer. And this is Beast. And already he's saying I can't climb the rope. Got a little funny here when they said she was a blue hippopotamus. He crossed his fingers behind his back, which means he's kind of fibbing. My mother said I can't climb the rope. Mrs. Miller stared at him. I want to climb, he said. He crossed his fingers in his back, behind his back again. I'm dying to climb, really I am, right to the top. Mrs. Miller was still looking at him. My mother said I can't. Richard shook his head. He tried to look sad. Mrs. Miller frowned. We're not climbing ropes today, she said. We're going to play a tisket, a tasket, a green and yellow basket. Everyone made a groaning sound. Ooh. Richard took a deep breath. He was saved. It was my favorite game when I was young, said Mrs. Miller. That's a baby game, Emily said under her breath. It's for kindergarten kids. Mrs. Miller blew her whistle. You're not playing anything, she told Emily. Sit on the bleachers. Jeez. Too bad we can't climb, Richard told Matthew. Matthew looked as if he wanted to cry. I was waiting to climb all weekend, he said. It's probably your fault, Beast, said Jason Bazak. All that stuff about your mother. Maybe Mr. Bell will be back soon, Richard said. Maybe he just has a cold. He waved his hand in the air. Yes, said Mrs. Miller. Did Mr. Bell break his leg? He asked. Richard tried to cross his toes and his fingers. He really does want him to be out for a long time. Then he uncrossed them. It wasn't nice to wish Mr. Bell had a broken leg. Of course not, Mrs. Miller said. Richard watched Emily go over to the bleachers. On the way, she grabbed the rope. She looked back at Mrs. Miller. Emily had made worse mad face before, Richard thought, but this was a really mad face. Jason came over to Richard. "This is all your fault," he said, "and your mother's too." "What's the matter with your mother anyway?" Timothy Barbario asked. "Nothing," said Richard. He thought about his mother. His mother didn't know they were going to climb. She probably wouldn't have been glad, though. She probably would have said, "Oh, maybe she would have said, 'That's great,' but I don't think so." Richard shook his head. They started to play a tisket-a-tasket. Nobody even called on him. Well, that, my friends, is sad. They're all blaming Richard, and, Richard shouldn't be fibbing, but it also isn't nice to be picking on Richard either. So, stay tuned for chapter 3. We'll see what happens.